Welcome to the Counter Narrative Podcast, a show designed to change the way we talk and think about education. By sharing stories of successes and triumphs, we aim to challenge the dominant narrative that often negatively portrays our disenfranchised populations. I'm your host, Charles Williams, an educator for 15 years, a current school principal in Chicago, and an educational consultant. Let's get started. So look, before we jump into this episode, I wanted to share a special holiday promotion that my friends over at Kick It Apparel are currently running. For a limited time, you can get customized gear at some amazing prices. I'm talking $25 hoodies, $15 tees, and $10 masks. These are the same people who hooked me up with my awesome Counter Narrative hoodie. Check them out at kickit.store and tell them that Charles sent you. In this episode, I chat with Craig Randall, who has had an eclectic educational career. He started as an elementary school counselor, then worked a year in the classroom with students who had severe behavior issues, before taking a major detour into small college basketball coaching for a number of years. Taking another significant detour, Craig and his wife Michelle decided to fulfill a dream by working at international schools. Craig taught in Warsaw, Poland, while also pursuing his principal's certification. He moved into school administration, first as an assistant principal and then principal, as they worked their way around the globe. Along the way, not terribly aware of it at the time, he was developing what would soon become his book. He and his family returned to the U.S. after a decade overseas, and that is when he wrote TrustBased Observations, which came out this past September. And now he is busy striving to change the world of teacher observations to a model of support that fosters risk-taking and growth. During our conversation, we talk about the dreaded teacher observations. To be honest, this is one of those things that neither teachers nor administrators truly enjoy. And that is precisely why Craig set out to do them differently. He points out that teaching is an art and should be treated as such. Traditional observational approaches place pressure on accountability and leads to teachers playing it safe instead of being innovative and creative. Instruction becomes more about checking off boxes than authentic learning opportunities. Listen as Craig shares some practical tips and suggestions for revamping this outdated and ineffective approach to improving teacher practices. Hello and welcome to the show, Craig. I am so happy to have you on board. As I was just mentioning to you, I just received your book in the mail. So excited to dive into this, and excited to have a conversation with somebody who clearly is on the same wavelengths as myself. But before we get started, if you could do myself a favor and all of our listeners, tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you're doing in education, and maybe a little interesting thing or two about you.
Okay. My name is Craig Randall. I just wrote a book that came out 4 weeks ago today called TrustBased Observations, and I'm incredibly passionate about the teacher observation process and finding a way to use it to support teachers in improving their practice. And so that's what I'm at right now is working on that and just starting some consulting and training, helping people with that. I would say going back, though, I have a very eclectic education career. I started out as an elementary and middle school counselor and did that for 7 or 8 years. And then, as sometimes we do in the world of education, we coach on the side at the high school. And I did a bunch of that. And an opportunity through that work came to coach at the college level. So I did a major detour with an incredibly supportive wife because we took a massive pay cut to become a small college basketball coach. And I did that for the next 7 years with my wife's support. And so I guess that would be an interesting, unique thing, fitting that in at the same time. And then my wife and I had always, when we first met, talked about like working internationally, international schools. And so we took another interesting detour and went to an international school job fair, which is a crazy endeavor where at the end of 3 days, you could end up working on any one of 4 different continents. And so we did that and spent the next, I think, 10 or 11 years doing that. And I got my principal certification while we were doing that. I taught at first doing that. And then I started working as an assistant principal and principal, and then came home and wrote a book. So there you go.
Well, welcome back. Welcome back. Can I ask, when you were teaching in those 10, 11 years, in the international schools, where are some of the places that you were at?
We started out in Warsaw, Poland, and I always say any country that has beer gardens on bike paths is a great place to live. And then we lived in Korea, and we lived in the Middle East, and we lived in Brazil as well. So really all over.
Wow, that is fascinating. In fact, I'm not sure if you're familiar with an organization, somebody who I've linked up with recently, and I know is doing some phenomenal work, called School Rubric. And so they do a lot of work with international schools. So just,
they contacted me just last week, and I'm going to start doing some work with them as well. And I told them, hey, because I knew you were connected with them, I said, yeah, I'm doing a podcast next week with Charles. So,
wow, look at that. Despite the fact that you get to travel and teach all over the world, it is still a small world, huh?
Yeah, when you live internationally in the international school world, that Kevin Bacon 6 degrees of separation story that you can find somebody in the international school world. We say it's 2 degrees. You can know somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody you worked with. It won't take any further than that.
Well, Craig, I'm curious, with all the time that you have spent, kind of in these different realms, from being an elementary and middle school counselor to coaching at the college level, to just spending, a decade, abroad teaching. I'm curious about your experiences and what have you seen, that may help to challenge the narrative around our current educational system?
Oh, that's a good question. I think this is one of the experiences that's maybe allowed me to develop trust-based observations is that, you're in the Chicago public schools, is that right?
Correct.
Okay. And so that is a massive ship, right? And so to make change or to do a turn, right, it takes a long time to make a turn in a ship. And so creating massive change in a school district the size of Chicago is not going to happen quickly, just because it's enormous. And there's so many factors that you have to work through to make a change. And because each international school is really its own body, and it's usually its own K-12 school that varies from a few hundred to at most 3,000 or 4,000 people, the ability to maybe be a speedboat and make a quick turn is really the way that those work. And so I think working in international schools, when something new came along, people were able to jump on the bandwagon or be able to try it out and experiment more quickly with something to see if it worked. And so I think just that ability to do that, I guess, played a big factor in my having the freedom to do something alternative with the observation process in terms of being a principal.
Can you share with us just a little bit about, I know you mentioned these, right? These trust-based observations. Can you share with us just a little bit about that and, how you got into that and maybe what impact you're hoping, or maybe you've already seen it have on education?
Sure. I would say maybe it originally started from at an international school, because things can work both ways in international schools because they're small too. Is I had at one point in time, I had 2 years in a row where I wasn't observed at all. And I remember feeling incredibly frustrated with that. And that was right about the same time that I started my principal certification program. And a buddy and I just kept talking about our frustrations and what we thought it should be. And then around the same time, my mentor at the program where I got my principal certification, he, in his supervision class, he started talking about just you have to be in classes every day. You have to be working with teachers, supporting teachers, giving them feedback. And like that sort of started it. And in that class, we would actually practice observations every day. And we would bring in our own little 10-minute mini lessons to teach while one person would be the observer, and then we'd do the reflective conversation right then. And then those conversations were always anchored by two questions, which still drive trusted observations now. And they were, what were you doing to help students learn? And if you had it to do over again, what, if anything, might you do differently? And so I think just starting with that, instantly, if you think about the way that a traditional observation process works, where it's me as the principal mostly giving you information and feedback and hopefully talking about strengths, but also giving you the ratings and all that, instantly we've changed it completely to be about you as the teacher and my listening to you. And so I think I've risen your value as a teacher in my eyes as a principal, or in their eyes, maybe, if you get what I'm saying. So so it's about them. And so I think that was a start. And then he also just started saying an hour a day. You got to spend an hour a day, which became for me 20-minute observations. And then when I got my first assistant principal job, I was really lucky. And I had a principal that had a whole career in the United States, and sort of his semi-retirement was going and working at an international school. And he was at a place where he really was most excited by having somebody young and passionate to work with, and that was me. And so I would bring him his ideas about what I wanted to do, and he would always just say, "Is it good for kids? Tell me how." And so I told him I wanted to do all these 20-minute observations, and he said, "Great, let's do it." And he started doing it too. And then as we did that, they were short observations, they were unannounced, but I felt like when I would go in and have the reflective conversation, I was maybe a little nervous, maybe being the new guy and wanting to be liked, but also just because I'd seen them so little, it seemed arrogant to offer suggestions. What if I offered a suggestion on something they were good at that I just didn't see that day? Like, how is that going to help? And so at first, I just ended up just sharing strengths of what I saw. And it was really amazing because teachers responded so well to that. Like, they hadn't really had that happen before. And then what was maybe even more amazing was 2 or 3 times in, they would start to say, okay, but what can I get better at? And so without knowing it, because I'd waited and pointed out strengths and just asked these questions, somehow trust had developed. And so that became another key element. And then it just gradually kept evolving from there. And so what ends up happening is when teachers trust you, when it does come time to offer a suggestion or ask permission to offer a suggestion, which is part of building trust as well. And some other things that I'll say is we would always have the observation reflective conferences in the teacher's room. Because again, it's about building trust. So if they're in their space, they're more comfortable. And we would sit beside them instead of across from them, because that minimizes that power differential that does exist because of our job titles. And we would type the notes on what the teacher said right there on the screen where they could see it all. So it was all transparent, all designed to build trust. And then when it came time to offer suggestions, I've seen people just flip their practice in just absolutely amazing ways. I had this AP economics teacher, and his content was amazing, and he was good at relationships and funny, but he was the classic at the lectern and lecturing and his students every year, he would get like about 20% of his students would get a 2 or a 1. But because we built up this relationship with him, when it came time for us to offer a suggestion, which for us was doing some Kagan cooperative learning training and beginning to incorporate that into his practice. So it became more we instead of me at the front. He totally embraced it. And the next year, he didn't have one student get a 2 or a 1. Everyone scored 3 or higher. And then he started leading Kagan cooperative learning trainings at the school the next year. So it was this amazing transformation. That's just one example. But I truly believe because we changed the narrative on how we did it.
You know, I'm first of all, I wanted to say I'm a huge fan of Kagan. Went through their trainings. It is something that I still use today. You know, just their principles. So, you know, again, right, yet another area that we are on the same wavelength. But you know, you bring up a good point. I think there's oftentimes this mindset, you know, and I hear this a lot from people who are outside of education that, you know, teachers do teaching because it's an easy job, right? I kind of come in, I do my thing, and you're like, wait, just spend a day, right? Spend a day in a classroom.
Well, parents all know better now, don't they? After the last 6 months.
Absolutely. You know, I joke there's a picture going around where somebody wrote on their like car window, it was like, "You lied. My child is not a pleasure to have in class." But I think what you're sharing with us, right, and anybody, right, I'm assuming most of the listeners here are educators, but we want that feedback. We want to know how we're doing because we want to get better, so that way we can then in turn impact, our students. And so I want to ask, in your opinion, in your experience, what are some of the reasons why this isn't happening? Like you said, it's an hour a day. And when we think about an hour, it's not very much. But why can leaders not give up that hour a day to be in classrooms?
Sure. And just in the interest of being transparent, I'm going to say that the way the system works is you do 12 visits a week. So Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, we do an hour doing the observations. But then Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, we also do the reflective conversation. So I'll add that Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, it's 2 hours a day, but still 8 hours out of really what are we working as principals, 50, 60 hours a week and more if we have, school events and all that. So it's not that much time to do it. But the reasons we're not, I think, to be honest, I think it's the system that we currently have in place. And if we trace it back to the 1983 report, A Nation at Risk, and which was totally designed to cause fear about our education system, and it was even they handpicked information to make it seem a lot worse than what it was, because really what was happening is way more students were going to high school and graduating. So graduation rates were increasing dramatically, but as that happened and more people were graduating, then test scores either stayed the same or slightly dropped, which would make sense, but they framed it in a fear-based way. And so then really, at least in my research that I did for the book, is that ever since then, there's this been growing sense, and it comes, I think, from politics and scaring people, that we have to be more accountable in terms of the process that we're doing it. And if we're more accountable, then we'll be able to improve better teaching and maybe get rid of bad teachers. I almost think it's been this left-brained type of approach, that this very logical, sequential, if A happens, then B happens. But one, teaching is craft and art. And two, people that get into teaching, they're big-hearted people that do it because they want to make a difference in the world. And so instead of being right-brained and about the relationships, it's all been about the process. And so then as that's happened, there have been more stringent accountability systems. And if we were to look at Marzano and Danielson, they're the templates of what they have in terms of what's good teaching, I would agree absolutely that every one of those is amazing. And I would even say that the rubrics that they have that list what's a basic level all the way to a proficient or advanced level, those are all really, really accurate. But as soon as we start to evaluatively rate teachers on that, then the research that I've seen, especially this man named Matt O'Leary out of Great Britain, who in my mind is the top researcher in the world on teacher observation and evaluation, his research says that as soon as we do that, teachers start to play it safe and they don't take risks in their practice anymore, because the truth is retention of your job factors into it on some level. So I think that's really what has happened over time. And, this is one of the most common conversations that I'll have with a teacher nowadays. And I find it to be sad, is that a teacher will say, well, yeah, I had an observation and the principal came in afterwards and they said everything was great, but I didn't see such and such pedagogy. So next time, can you do that so I can mark it off? So if we think about that, like mark it off, then it's not authentic for the teacher. It's not authentic for the principal. That's not about teaching and learning. So I think the process of the way it's evolved over the last 25, 30 years has made it so the process, frankly, isn't very fun for either party. And so everyone just sort of plays their game and does what they do to get it out of the way, instead of really genuinely having it being about improving teaching and learning.
It's interesting that you talked about, this increased pressure on accountability leads to teachers playing it safe, right? And we take a look then, as you mentioned, such as A Nation at Risk, and we're saying, oh, students are not performing, student proficiency isn't where it needs to be. And yet there are these systems in place that, like you said, well, if I try to do something creative and I fail, and it happens to be the 1 out of 2 times you're in my classroom observing me, yeah, right? I'm going to be marked as, inefficient or whatever ranking terminology is being used. And I don't feel like doing that. So I'm going to kind of find that middle level and then just coast along to make sure that I'm doing okay, but doing a massive disservice to our students in the process.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I don't want to say that there aren't teachers that aren't still taking risks, because we know there are. But I think overall, it tends to make people play it that way. And I think with trust-based observations, on our actual observation template, we have an area on there that we don't even really rate. We don't rate, period, in trust-based observations, but we have it on the form. And it's not really an area that I look for. If I notice it, it's great. But it's called risk-taking innovative practice. And the real reason that it's on the form is as a reminder for principals or whoever's doing the observing to make sure that they remind teachers every time that if I go into your classroom and I watch you do something new, and if it bombs, which it rarely does, but let's just say it does, that the next day you're going to get a fist bump, or maybe nowadays an elbow bump to be safer, and you're going to get congratulations because you took taking risks. And just my concrete core belief is if we persist in taking risks in our practice, we will improve. But we have to create the conditions that are going to make it safe for teachers to embrace or at least accept the vulnerability that comes with that and eliminate features that are getting in the way of that.
So, Craig, you talk about something that I've been talking about in a different context, but it's this idea of if I'm going to step outside of my comfort zone, if I'm going to step outside of the norm, then there should be systems in place to support me, right? And so this idea of trust-based observation tells teachers that, continue taking those risks, continue being innovative, continue potentially failing in trying to do what's right for your students, because this observation system is going to be there to catch you and to support you throughout this process of growth, if you will. Yep. So I'm curious, do you have any tips or strategies for leaders out there who are saying, Craig, this sounds great. I would love to do something like this. Yep. But my district, mandates that we use this model or this approach. Yep. What are some tips or strategies that you may have for them?
Sure, it's a great question. And in my state of Washington, actually, you're mandated to use either Marzano or Danielson or the University of Washington's Self-ID. So it's difficult and challenging. And so this is what I think, because I think out there are going to be people that listen to this or that read the book. And I know it because I've already heard it, that are going to go, yes, wow, this is exactly what I'm doing. And I think it's not just going to be principals. I think there's going to be principal supervisors. I think there's going to be superintendents that are going to do that. And so, one, when you're in that situation, then see if someone will let you do it. And if they won't let you do it, see if they'll let you maybe pilot it like with one school. And if they won't let you pilot it with one school, then maybe can I pilot it with 5 or 10 teachers? And we've got to start small and just do what we can to get in. And then even within the framework of what we can or can't do with depending, because not everyone's going to be in that situation, I realize. And I think it's also, in my mind, because I'm on a mission to change this, it's we do what we can until we get that, ideally a Malcolm Gladwell tipping point, where then that becomes the new norm. And that becomes the way that legislatures mandate that we have to do it. Hopefully, we can argue about all that stuff later. But even if we can't do all of those things right now, we can do things like we can go into the teacher's classroom afterwards, like we're saying. We can sit beside them afterwards. We can ask reflective questions afterwards that make it about them. We can bring our most kind, empathetic, understanding self to these conversations, use our emotional intelligence in our conversations. And I think if we think about teaching, at least in my mind and to all of my experiences, there's no other job in the world where, as part of your evaluation process, someone comes into your office, as it were, sits down, pops open a laptop, looks at, to me, an inordinately large number of indicators and watches you for 30, 40 minutes to an hour and takes notes on that and then gives you a feedback conversation, you're rating you on that. Could you imagine, let's just say if it was a coffee shop and it was a barista and the manager popped down a chair behind the counter and watched the barista make coffee for an hour and then had a conversation on that the next day. And so I think as principals, having an understanding of just how vulnerable a situation that is, and never forgetting that. I mean, we were all teachers at some point, and using that to guide our tones and the words we use and our actions and our interactions with teachers, to, even if we can't do everything, we can do everything in our power to make it as safe as possible for teachers.
I think one of the things that you just mentioned reminds me of, and I don't know where I heard it, but it is something that I have adopted and I share with my teachers, right? When I do observations, it's not a gotcha tool, right? It's an I've got you tool, right?
I like that. I like that.
It's this idea that I'm coming in and I'm watching you, right? And as you mentioned, you got to build the trust and things like that. But the whole purpose of this is not to rank you. The whole purpose of this is to help you become better, in your profession. But you're absolutely right. It is a vulnerable situation. And we as school leaders have to remember what it's like to be sitting in those places, to have somebody come in and just watch you. Right. My wife tells me all the time, like, I would never allow you to observe one of my lessons. She's like, absolutely not. So
Yeah.
absolutely. Well, I appreciate that. I'm hoping, as you said, this catches on, right? Because we are in a place right now that education could be revolutionized, right? The upside, I guess, if you will, to this pandemic is it puts us into a place where we can question almost every aspect of education. And observations is just one of those many areas.
I agree completely, and I think it's the perfect time to be able to look. And look, if there was ever a time when everyone in the world, parents and everyone, realized that teachers require more support, emotionally and otherwise, and really recreating practice in the settings that we're having to do, it's now. So let's take advantage of that.
Well, Craig, I want to say thank you for sharing with us today. And before we begin wrapping up here, I want to ask, I'm sure there are people out there who are listening and saying, hey, I got to get a copy of that book. I need to follow this guy. I want to pick his brain. So where, one, can people find that book? And two, how can people find you and follow you on social media or wherever else you may be?
Thank you. You can get the book on Amazon and TrustBased Observations. And my Twitter handle is at TrustBased Craig. I am on LinkedIn. Just Craig Randall is my name. I also have a website called TrustBased.com. You could email me through Craig at TrustBased.com as well. So those are the best ways to get a hold of me.
Wonderful. I appreciate it. And so if you are listening, I would highly recommend that you go and check him out. Like I said, I already have a copy of the book. Very excited to dive into this and hopefully continue changing the way that I do my observations with my teachers. So Craig, thank you for all the work that you've done all around the world and for helping to shape maybe what will be the future of education here. So I want to say thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Charles. I really am grateful for the opportunity to talk about and hopefully spread the word on trust-based observations.
If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Don't believe me? Here's 5 reasons why. First, it's free. Second, there's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. 3, Anchor will distribute your podcast for you, so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and so many more. 4, you can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. And 5, it's everything you need to make a podcast, all in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. I want to thank you for listening to the Counter Narrative Podcast. If you like what you are hearing, please be sure to like and subscribe. The show can be found on Anchor, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, and several of your other favorite platforms. This podcast is also featured on schoolrubric.com, where you can find educational articles, videos, and interviews with educators from around the globe. Be sure to connect with the host and other listeners by following the show on Twitter at the CN Podcast and joining the show's Facebook group. Take care.